Are you expecting Nikon to announce a new camera ahead of CP Plus coming up in just a couple of weeks? What about the Nikon Z6 Mark III, the Nikon Z7 Mark III, or the much anticipated Nikon Z8? And the specs of the Nikon Z8, do you expect that they'll compete against the recently announced and shipped Sony a7 R5 or the much older Canon EOS R5? Details coming up, but first, please do me a favor and follow me on Twitter, subscribe, choose all notifications, like, comment, and all that good stuff, as it really does help this channel grow. Nikon Rumours says that they were told that Nikon will not announce any new products for the 2023 CP Plus show in Japan. It's going to be held between February the 23rd and February the 26th. Knowing that there's a lot of interest in the Nikon Z8, Nikon Rumours went further. I have not heard any Nikon Z8 updates for a while, so I'll assume whatever I reported last year is still valid. And this is what Nikon Rumours said last year in November. The Nikon Z8 camera has been rumored for a while, but we still don't have any reliable leaked specifications. I was told that in terms of price and specs, the Nikon Z8 will compete head-to-head with the recently announced Sony a7 R5 at $3,900. That's pretty vague, but it does give us some boundaries that the Nikon Z8 is going to be a close competitor to the Sony a7 R5, so around $3,900, the same price as the Canon EOS R5. But in terms of the specs, well, let's take a look at the Sony a7 R5. That camera has the same resolution as the Sony a7 R4 at 61 megapixels. It's a stacked sensor. I was expecting that the Nikon Z8 would basically take the same, sensor and image processor found in the Nikon Z9, giving us 61 or somewhere around 61 megapixels. Well, that would mean a new sensor as well as a new image processor. And in terms of autofocus, the Sony a7 R5 has a new AI deep learning autofocus system that also has a new AI chip. The Nikon Z9, well, it doesn't have a new AI chip, and I'm not so sure that Nikon's going to come up with a new AI chip or license the one from Sony. But now let's take a look at the video resolutions. The Sony a7 R5 can do 8K at 24 and 25 frames per second, no 30 frames per second, and no RAW. And if you're going to be shooting in 24 or 25 frames per second 8K, you are going to have to deal with a 1.2 times crop. So will the Nikon Z9 go up to 30 frames per second? Will it allow for RAW or Apple ProRes? Well, the Nikon Z9 allows for Apple ProRes, but only in 4K, not 8K. And in 8K, well, it doesn't do any cropping. So what about the other video resolutions and frame rates? Well, the Sony a7 R5 can do 4K up to 60 frames per second, but it can't go 100 or 120 frames per second. Although it can do up to 120 frames per second in 1080, and of course it can do 10-bit 422. But now let's go back to the stills capabilities of this camera, because I think it's stronger in the stills capabilities more than the video capabilities. A 61 megapixel stacked sensor, 10 frames per second. That's an awful lot of data that's going to be pushing, and thanks to its dual CF Express Type A cards, it shouldn't have any problem doing that. Sony's EVF has got the highest resolution on the market at 9.44 million dots. It's got a touchscreen that's 3.2 inches, but it's got that new 4-axis touchscreen, which allows it to flip out, which is great for a lot of vloggers. But when it comes to shooting things like wildlife where you don't want to change your line of sight, that 4-axis touchscreen works very, very well. But Nikon Rumours left out one other camera that's a direct competitor to the Sony a7 R5, and that will be a direct competitor to the Nikon Z8. And that's the Canon EOS R5, although it's no longer selling for $3,900. It recently went on sale for $200 off starting Black Friday, but it just recently went on for $400 off. It now sells for $34.99. Nikon's late to the game. You know it, I know it, and the competition knows it. The competition was established back in 2020 with the Canon EOS R5 and then with the Sony a7 R5 in late 2022. So let's imagine what the Nikon Z8 could be if it borrowed some of the same specifications as the Canon EOS R5. Like the Nikon Z9, it has a 45 megapixel sensor, but that's lower than the Sony a7 R5 at 61 megapixels. In terms of image processor, it's got the Digic X image processor, which is very powerful. It results in much less rolling shutter, and it makes this a very powerful camera for stills and video. While the Canon EOS R5 doesn't have a dedicated AI chip like the Sony a7 R5, it does borrow the same algorithms that's found in the 1DX Mark III, the R3, the R6 Mark II, having deep learning AI capabilities. It just doesn't have a dedicated AI chip. And in terms of AI tracking, well, it can do people, head eye detection, animal eye detection. It can do all sorts of animals, cats, dogs, and even insects. It can do trains, planes, and automobiles. The only thing it can't do is UFOs. So whether you're talking about big planes, small planes, fast trains, slow trains, freight trains. It's a highly reliable autofocus system, and I'd like to see Nikon improve their autofocus system algorithms in the Nikon Z8 and then release a firmware update for the Nikon Z9. But as far as Canon goes with an autofocus system in the R5, with so many different firmware updates released since the product was released back in 2020, it got a big boost back with firmware 1.5, providing it with, well, for example, vehicle eye detection. If you're doing motorsports or doing motorcycles and somebody's wearing a helmet, it'll still track the car, but focusing on the helmet of the driver. Pretty impressive. But the video specifications is where the R5 is unmatched, even here in 2023. Unlike the Sony a7 R5, it'll do 8K video in not only 24, 25, but also 30 frames per second, and it will do it in IPB, all eye, and even RAW. And in 4K, unlike the Sony a7 R5, it can do 4K at 24, 25, 30 frames per second, 50, 60 frames per second, and 100 and 120 frames per second. Again, that's more than the Sony a7 R5 at 4K 60. I wouldn't be surprised if the Nikon Z8 was able to do 4K 120 as well. It can do 10-bit 422 video, and unlike the Sony a7 R5 with a 9.44 million EVF, the Canon has a 5.76 million EVF, and it's also blackout free at 120 frames per second. And the LCD, not like the Sony a7 R5 with that 4-axis articulating flip screen or LCD, I'd like to see that in the latest, or the successor to the Canon EOS R5, and I'd like to see that in the Nikon Z8, so that's a real possibility as well. And unlike the Sony a7 R5, it doesn't have dual CF Express card slots, but it does have one CF Express Type B card slot, which has twice the throughput as Type A, so there's definitely a benefit in having, I'd rather have one CF Express Type B card slot than two Type A, just because you get so much more, well, throughput. So being able to do 8K RAW at 325 megabytes per second isn't a problem, or shooting at 20 frames per second at 45 megapixels. And that's one way in which the Canon EOS R5 tops the Sony a7 R5 in terms of stills capabilities. 10 frames per second on the Sony a7 R5, although you're at a higher resolution, but on the Canon EOS R5 at a slightly slower resolution of 45 megapixels, you're able to push 20 frames per second electronic or 12 frames per second mechanical. I wouldn't be surprised if the Nikon Z8 will approach more of the Canon specifications in this regard. Would you like to see the Nikon Z8 specifications closer to that of the Sony a7 R5 or the Canon EOS R5? Or what about the recently leaked specifications for the Canon EOS R5 Mark II? Specs that have been yet to be validated but do come from known and reliable sources according to Canon Rumours. The Canon EOS R5 is supposed to have a 61 megapixel backside illuminated sensor. That's the same resolution as the Sony a7 R5 and a good 60 megapixels more than the Nikon Z9. And in terms of image processor, it doesn't get one DigiX image processor, but two. And that's going to allow the Canon EOS R5 Mark II to push an awful lot more data. In terms of frame rates at 61 megapixels, remember, the Sony a7 R5, well, it could do 10 frames per second. The Canon EOS R5 Mark II, according to leaked specifications, 30 frames per second electronic or 12 frames per second mechanical. That's pretty impressive. At 61 megapixels, that's a huge amount of data. That's something you can't do with dual CF Express Type A cards, and that's why the Canon EOS R5 Mark II is supposed to have dual CF Express Type B card slots. 30 frames per second, 61 megapixels. Now that's impressive. Now that's where I'd like to see the Nikon Z8 aim. And in terms of video capabilities, well, the Canon EOS R5 Mark II is supposed to be able to go to 8K 60 frames per second. That's the same as the Nikon Z9, but there's no mention in the leaked specifications if that's RAW, all eye, or IPB. And in terms of 4K, well, unlike the Canon EOS R5, which could do 8K oversample 4K in the video shooting mode 4K HQ or 4K Fine, the Canon EOS R5 Mark II can do oversample video in 4K 24, 25, 30, 50, and 60 frames per second, as well as 100 and 120 frames per second. And in terms of Full HD or 1920 by 1080, well, the Canon EOS R5 Mark II can shoot 240 frames per second. That's double what the Sony a7 R5 can do at, well, 120 frames per second. So this camera is supposed to be coming out in the second quarter of 2023. And the second quarter starts, well, April, May, and June. So it starts in April and it goes all the way to June. And I think the most likely time would be somewhere in May if the rumored specifications prove to be true, because April's all about NAB 2023, and NAB is all about the National Association of Broadcasters, a very different type of, well, camera industry, more dealing with cinema and broadcast cameras. So I could see Canon tease at NAB 2023, just like they teased at NAB 2020. Other specs that the Canon EOS R5 Mark II is supposed to get: a full-size HDMI slot and a 9.44 million EVF, the same resolution found in the Sony a7R5. And also found in the Sony a7R5, that 4-axis LCD, well, that's also supposed to come to the Canon EOS R5 Mark II. No one knows the specifications for the Nikon Z8 other than Nikon, but we all know that Nikon needs to aim higher than a camera that was released back in 2020, being the Canon EOS R5. And the Sony a7R5, well, it got a modest update over the a7R4 and doesn't beat Canon in terms of video and stills capabilities. The Canon EOS R5 can shoot 20 frames per second electronic versus 10 frames per second for the Sony a7R5. And in terms of video, 8K RAW at 30 frames per second, whereas the Sony a7R5 can shoot 8K, not RAW, at only 24 or 25 frames per second. Here's what we know, and it's not a lot. Nikon isn't going to be releasing a camera ahead of CP Plus here in 2023. And according to Nikon Rumours, the most likely scenario is a Z8 announcement in late spring 2023, late March, or even Q2, and a potential shipment in and around May of 2023. What do you think? What would make you happy? If the Nikon Z8 delivered the same specifications as a Sony a7R5, or what about the Canon EOS R5, or even the leaked specifications for the Canon EOS R5 Mark II, specifications that haven't been validated yet, but are coming from a known source and are rated as a CR2. What do you think Nikon needs to do with the specifications and capabilities for the Nikon Z8? Let me know in the comment section down below. And if you want to stay up to date on the latest camera news and rumors, go ahead and subscribe and choose all notifications. By choosing all notifications, as soon as I publish a new video like this one here on the Nikon Z8 specs or the Canon EOS R5 Mark II, you'll get notified by YouTube, so that way you can stay up to date on the latest camera news and rumors. And for all those other news stories that aren't big enough to go in a video, I publish those on my Twitter site, Ordinary Filmmaker. And if you're interested in purchasing any camera gear in the upcoming months, please consider using my affiliate links down below for Amazon.com and B&H. It really does help support this channel along with your subscriptions, follows, likes, and comments. I do very much appreciate it. Because of you, this rinky-dink channel has now reached 36,000 subscribers. I started it just 3 years ago in 2019. It's hard to believe this journey that I've actually reached this point, but again, I couldn't do it without you. Have yourself a great Sunday and have yourself a great week. But that's it for now. We'll see you again soon.